Hi, and welcome to Series 3 of the Pen to Publish podcasts with your hosts, Alexa Whitten, author, typesetter, and independent publisher, and
Alexa Tewkesbury, author, editor, and proofreader.
Hi, and welcome to the 5th episode of the Pen to Publish podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about what goes into a book, and I'm going to be discussing business style books or how-tos, as well as fiction, novels and the like, and children's books. Now, Alexa, you're a published author. I'm keen to see if some of these ingredients are in your book too.
The children's books that I've written so far, they've been commissioned by traditional publishers, so I haven't self-published, but certainly the front matter in the books that I've had published, so the pages before the story starts, they do follow a set pattern. And I think for self-published books, following that format does give them a really professional looking finish. There's a children's series that we've just started working on together, and it had been previously published in a kind of unedited form, but you've taken the beginning and you've made those early pages look just really fantastic. Just by inserting these extra pages, it just makes it look like it is a professionally published book. Mm-hmm. I mean, you don't necessarily want to turn the cover and find the story starting right there. That's not what we're used to. I think it's how we're conditioned, for the way books should look. And there's something satisfying, I think, about opening a book and then glancing through all the introductory pages before you get to the first chapter. It feels complete. And for children's picture books, especially, there's also an opportunity to be creative with the way those pages are designed. So even before the story starts, your book can be looking fantastic.
Yes, definitely. I mean, I really like that part of the children's book design processes, because you can be really decorative and imaginative, and it's something that I really enjoy doing. Having these elements will not only allow you to connect with your reader, but also get more return on your self-publishing investment. Remember, right at the beginning of the series, I said that it's very hard to make money at the front end of your book. And by that, I mean in terms of making money in sales. You'll have to be selling thousands of books to do that. But if you have some of the things that I'll be mentioning in this episode, then you'll have a much better chance of making money on the back end. So let's start with fiction. This is probably the easiest one to implement and to follow. So the ingredients that you need for adult fiction are quite simple. You need a title page. That's the first page of the book and states the name of the book, but in more simplistic form than the cover. On the reverse of that comes the title verso, which is Latin for the reverse of the title.
Funnily
enough. And that's where all your copyright info and details of who published your book goes. As an aside, if this isn't your first novel or you have advanced reviews of your book, you can have the first few pages dedicated to these, and they can go before the title page. You can also list the series of your book too. So say, for instance, you've got more than one book in the series. So let's just go that you have advanced reviews are the first 2 pages, then you have your title page, then you have your title verso. The next page can be a dedication, if applicable, and then you usually have a blank page on the reverse of that, or a quote of some sort can come after that as well. Some novelists like to have a dedication to their partner or child. Then you turn over blank page. Then on the next page, a right-hand page, you have a quote that is applicable, obviously, to the novel that you're writing. You can then have a prologue, again, if appropriate. This can share some information about the story, something the reader ought to know right at the very, very front, but it's not a must-have. You don't have to have a prologue, but some people like to have a prologue, especially if the novel perhaps is a historical fiction and you need to know a bit of important information right at the beginning. Then the story, which I always think should start, chapter 1, I think should always start on the right-hand page. And simple chapter number is all that is necessary. I find chapter names for adult fiction is a bit precious, and I also think it kind of reeks of amateurish self-publishing. Most adult fiction don't have chapter names. You can, of course, have parts of the book. So you might have part 1, part 2, part 3. A lot of authors have that if necessary. And those obviously can be named, and they would obviously appear before the first chapter. Then at the end of the book, you can have an epilogue if you feel it needs it. This can be a future look at what happens next within your story. And then you can have an excerpt, if this is appropriate, of the next book in the series, if you have it already written. Then you can have acknowledgements, which is a treasure trove of info. Don't ever skip acknowledgements. I love reading acknowledgements because you can really get an insight as to who's helped write the book. And then you can have about the author. Again, I think this is of real value to your reader and can add all of your social media info there. Clever authors have a mailing list where the reader can sign up and hear all about their next novel. So for authors like Lee Child, he has a webpage dedicated to the fans of the protagonist, Jack Reacher, and you can join in on all sorts of extra stuff. Plus, you get exclusive news about book signings and exclusive content. This is a great way to get your readers' details and be able to then market them with your upcoming books. Don't forget, Amazon don't tell you who bought the books. So to be able to get those readers' information is vital. And also it'll just make you then be able to market to people who've already put their hand up and said, I like your book. So that's fiction. Non-fiction business or self-help books are pretty much the same front matter, although there are a few things that are different. So let me go through those. So you can have testimonials at the front, title page, title verso, copyright info, and dedication. Then we get in to add some extra lovely stuff, and they are as follows. And you don't need to have all of these things. This is just what you could have if appropriate. So firstly, you can have a foreword. This can be really popular. Now, a foreword is written by somebody else, not the author. I often see writers write their own foreword, and I have to politely tell them that it needs to be written by a third party. The foreword is usually a look at the book's issue from an expert's point of view, and they highlight the need to understand the book's message in more detail. I always encourage my writers to try and find an authority in the subject, as having a foreword by on the cover of the book can be a real enticing selling point for the reader, especially if you're only selling on places like Amazon where you only have the front cover on offer. Now, this is where a bit of controversy comes into play, as I mentioned last week, and it is all to do with where this goes. Does it go before the contents? And that's another ingredient of this book, or after the contents? Now, I like the foreword to go after the contents, but purists say it should go before the contents, as the name does mean the word before anything. I'm not sure anyone will tell you that you're wrong, and whichever choice you make is totally up to you. I like my forewords to come after the contents because I just think it looks nicer.
It feels wrong because the contents isn't something that you sort of open the book and start reading. You might scan through them, but when you've got a chunk of writing and then it's the contents, it just feels a bit about face. So I agree with you.
Yeah, I agree. So then we have contents. Now, this should denote the important parts of the book. Now, most non-fiction books don't have contents, although interestingly, teen fiction tends to, and some early Penguin classics also have contents, bizarrely, but most modern day fiction doesn't. Now, for a business style self-help book, definitely have a page of contents. This is a really valuable resource for the reader. How much detail you go into is up to you. I tend to go by length of book. So if it's a small book, say less than 150 pages, then I would keep the contents fairly simple, perhaps just highlighting the parts of the book, the chapter headings, and maybe one heading after that. But of course, you can go into much more detail if you want to. Now, this is where your heading hierarchy comes into play. And sometimes it's not until the contents are generated, and that's usually at the end of the typesetting process, can you see if your heading hierarchy is correct. I'll be talking more about heading hierarchy in much more detail in the next series of the podcast because it's quite a difficult subject to talk about. But basically, you want your table of contents to be a real juicy opener to what's inside your book. And you can actually use your table of contents as a marketing tool as well when it comes to selling your book. But we'll be talking about marketing your book in series 5. Now, next comes the preface, if appropriate. And notice we don't have prologues in business nonfiction books. Prologues only go into fiction, not in nonfiction. So a preface is usually the author's commentary about the subject which is being spoken about. It's a precursor to the subject, and it's only really applicable if it's warranted. Don't try and have a preface just for the sake of it, because you'll look a bit pretentious. So only use a preface if it's really important part of the reader understanding the rest of the book. This then goes before the introduction. So next comes the introduction. This should all be about the subject at hand, not all about you, the author. I've had to gently inform authors that at the beginning of the book, most readers don't actually care about the author at this stage, unless you're a famous person. So make the intro about the subject and what the book is about, as well as how to read the book. Now, that may sound very obvious, but you'll be surprised at how handy it is to have a book that explains how it works. Do they read the book in order, or can they dip in and out of it? Is there something else they can add, like writing in a notebook or whatever? I also like to explain if there are any handy tips throughout, or whether there's a wrap-up section at the end of each chapter. Then, after the main part of the book is written, you can have a conclusion. This is a nice space to wrap up all the important points of a book and repeat any important messages that have been explained throughout. You can then have an afterword if you want to, instead of a conclusion. I wouldn't normally have both, as they're kind of the same thing. And you don't have to have an afterword. So let's say you've decided to have a foreword and then wrap it up with a conclusion, or you can have a foreword and then don't have a conclusion, but have an afterword if you want to. And this goes right at the end of the book. An epilogue is used for fiction, and it doesn't fit in a business book. So you don't have an epilogue. It's either a conclusion or an afterword. References. So these are extra bits of information that need to be shared, but not at the point of where they appear in the book. For instance, if you've spoken about a specific article that relates to a subject, then you would put a little number, which is called a superscript, beside that word, and then recite the full reference of that in the back of the book. References are complicated things, and there are lots of referencing styles. And Alexa, I'm sure you can probably jump in here and explain referencing styles, because they are a subject in themselves.
Oh, referencing. Yes. When I receive a book and there's footnotes, it's like, oh, good. Anyway, when you reference a book, an article or an online post or a podcast, it's important to follow a standard format for how that element should look. So for a book, this could be the name of the author. And then you have to decide, is that going to be the surname you're going to put first or the Christian name first in your list? The name of the book, which is generally in italics. And then in brackets, you'll put the publisher, the place of publication, and the year of publication. But if it's an article, you would again list the author's name first, but in an article wouldn't be listed in italics as a book title is, it would be in inverted commas. And then the source of the article, so the magazine or the journal that it's taken from, that would be in italics. Now, a lot of writers and publishers follow the Harvard referencing system, which you may have even heard of from school. I think it's still used in schools and universities. Certainly, that's the system that I had to follow when I was writing essays, and my son and daughter did too. And it's basically, the Harvard referencing system is basically, it just sets out the order in which those elements that I've just mentioned are to be listed. Mm-hmm. But equally, in traditional publishing, some publishers may have their own referencing style. So I'll sometimes, if I'm doing an editing job or a proofreading job for a traditional publisher, they'll send me their house style, and it'll include how to lay out references, which, you know, it does pretty much follow the Harvard referencing system, but there may be small differences that are specific to a particular publisher. But I think the key thing is just to be consistent in how your references are laid out. So make sure book titles are always in italics, make sure articles are always in inverted commas. And this is something that your proofreader will be looking out for, but it's also helpful for you if you can get this part as accurate as possible before you submit your manuscript. And the other thing about references in terms of placing in a book is that there's a bit of a choice there too. So you can have them at the very back of the book, all grouped together. You can also have them as footnotes at the bottom of each page where a book or whatever it is referenced. Or you might choose to have them at the end of a chapter. So, I mean, Alexa, I don't know whether you have any preferences where you like authors to place their notes or their references. I don't know whether it's easier from a typesetting point of view to have them all at the back.
Well, I actually, as a reader, I'm a fan of the references being a footnote, because then I'm not having to always constantly go to the back of the book to find out about the information that's just been shared. So, for instance, there's a really good book, it's called The Five, and it's all about the 5 victims of Jack the Ripper. And there were lots of references, obviously, throughout the book. But I was really finding it a bit of a struggle. Every time there was a superscript number, I had to go to the back of the book, find the right chapter, find the right reference, and then read it. Whereas if it was at the bottom of the page in a footnote, it would be so much easier. However, what you don't want is a page, or, you know, a third of a page, and then 2/3 of the page being footnotes, because there are so many references.
Yeah, I have seen that actually, and it's not a good look, really.
No. So I think I think it depends on the project. I think it depends on how many references there are within a page. With the book that I was reading about Jack the Ripper, the references, I think, were important, because it wasn't necessarily following up with an article. It was actually following up with more information. And I think if it's following up with more information that you're reading at the point of reading, it should be a footnote. Whereas if it's just a reference to an article that you can go and find out more about it, then have that at the back of the book. Does that make sense? So if it's actually written information that is going to enhance your understanding of the text, then have it as a footnote. But if it's just referencing an article, then have it at the back of the book. References and footnotes, they are very complicated things. So if you don't know what you're doing, obviously always ask your editor and typesetter to make sure that they understand, because I've worked on a lot of projects where my other editor, Lindsay, is a referencing queen, and she's brilliant at sourcing them, making sure that they are set out properly. And I just let her get on with it because she's just brilliant at it. Right, so after references come the appendix or appendices. And this is where even more information about a subject can be shared. It's perfect if the topic being explained in the appendix is off topic from where it was mentioned. For example, I've just typeset a book all about development aid. And within the text, the author wanted to add in some extra examples and information about a specific topic he was talking about. And rather than go off tangent at the place where he was talking about it, he just referenced the reader to go to the appendix, where all that extra stuff would be expanded on. And actually, I think it looks, you know, for a book to have appendices, I just think it looks, I don't know, just think it looks even more scholarly. I like
knowledgeable.
Yes, exactly. And I do believe Lucille, who we're going to be interviewing our episode 8, she had all the biz. Her book's full of all the biz, everything that we're talking about. So she'll be able to explain a bit more. And an index. Now, an index is definitely needed for a complex subject. However, formatting an index is just as complex. And did you know there are actually specific designers that just deal in indexing?
Yeah, I know there are indexers. You know, being an indexer, that is a job title. Mm-hmm. But I have to be honest, it's not something I would want to do in a million years. I mean, I take my hat off to anyone who can tackle that, because it gives me brain fog just thinking about it. You probably know what an index is, but an index is not the contents. No. An index is where somebody is going through and creating that for you from specific terms. So if, for example, you've mentioned global warming in your book, and somebody might be looking for that term in your book to find out what you've got to say, they can look in the index and find global warming, and then all the page numbers where it's mentioned in the book. Yeah. I mean, such a meticulous job. I really don't think I could do that. I think it's amazing that there are people that can.
I know. So Lucille, who I just mentioned, is going to be our guest on episode 8. She wanted an index in her book, and it was a very detailed publication that dealt with communication in the workplace. And we had to hire a specialist indexer to create the index. I mean, I don't know how the process works. I mean, I looked into it to see if it was something I could do, but it was far too complicated and just not my cup of tea. So if anyone wants an index, I do tell them that it's not part of my quote. It is an expensive added extra, and it is something that someone else needs to do. And that's what happened with Lucille's book.
Just as you need professional training for typesetting and proofreading and editing, you need it for indexing. The person who does your index needs to know exactly what they're doing.
Yeah, exactly. So after the index, you can then have a what's next. So this is a great space for telling your audience where they can go now once they've read the book. This is where a clear call to action can be shared, although ideally you want clear call to actions within the book anyway. I'll be talking about those in more detail too in the next series, although in series 5, we're going to be talking about marketing. So it's a good idea to get all of this sorted for that. Now you can offer a very special reader offer here. It's these sorts of special offers that will encourage people to your website so that it then doesn't matter where they bought the book because you'll get their details. This is where you make money on the back end that I was telling you about right at the beginning. This is where you really start to crank up getting a return on your investment. Then you have about the author, and this is where you talk all about you, not at the beginning because readers don't care by this stage, but by the end of the book, they probably do. So about the author. And this is written in third person. You can explain a short history of your background, where you learnt the stuff that you've explained or talked about, and then go to share a bit about more personal stuff about yourself. So what you like to do in your spare time and who you live with, where you live, what you like to do, etc. Let the reader into your life. It's a great space to allow to do this. And then you have acknowledgements. And as I said, with fiction, I love the acknowledgement section. It's a real insight into how the book came about usually and who helped. You can literally thank anyone and everyone who has helped you get to the stage that you're at, although don't be too overindulgent. You don't want an overly long Oscar speech. I had one chap who had his acknowledgements that ran to 4 pages. It really was his Oscar moment. He was thanking his English teacher. He was thanking his, all sorts. It's very sweet. Right. Children's books. So we've got all of the front matter, title verso, and reviews if you want to. Jodie's just done her second book, and she's got right at the beginning, she's got what people thought of her first book at the beginning of her second. After the title verso, I like a book belongs to, because it encourages the child then to add in their name. And you can also put the dedication, if you want to, on the title verso page, so you don't waste a whole page, because really children's books, they don't really care who it's dedicated to, but you can put the dedication on the title verso page. You can, of course, have a contents page if you think it's necessary, but I don't tend to do the ones that I typeset, certainly not the picture books that I've done, because you don't really need a contents for a picture book. But for slightly older readers or young adult, they might like a contents if the chapters are named.
I think if a YA book has chapter titles, then I think it's nice to have a contents page. But as long as the chapter titles don't give away an important plot twist, if you've suddenly introduced a character or something that is going to be a surprise, but you've included their name in the contents, then it can be a bit of a giveaway. Yeah. But I think it's quite inviting at the start of a book. And I remember, I don't know if this is just me, but I remember as a child, I took huge pleasure in referring back to the contents every now and then to see how far down the list of chapters I'd read. I loved that. I used to think, wow, I've read all those.
So what age range would you say that would be good for then?
When I remember doing that, they must have been puffin books. So probably middle grade, kind of 7 to 11, 12 maybe. Also, again, I don't know if it's just me, but I hate starting a chapter and then having to stop in the middle of the chapter. I always like to complete a chapter, but I always flick forward and see, have I got time to read 12 pages now? I'm not sure. And then I won't do it if I haven't got the time at that minute. Yeah. But if you look in the contents, you can see easily, that one's only 5 pages long. Yeah, I can read that quickly.
Yeah.
So I think it's useful.
So next after that then comes suggested reading tips. Now, I mention this because this is a very popular addition to children's books, as it allows you to explain how to read the book to the child. I know that may sound obvious, but I think with extra activities or suggested learning from the author's point of view, I think this is a really clever idea. I did this with Jodie Hayes' book, the When Wally series. And it's very apt as the book deals with quite complex issues that the adult, when reading to the child, then needs to explain or help with. Also, Laura did it with Don't Be Silly.
I suppose it with maybe with a purely fiction book that's not trying to teach anything. It is just a story. I suppose perhaps that's how to read it and extra activities and all suggested learning. Maybe that's not quite so relevant if it's purely fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Although in a series of picture books that I have out, there are questions on the stories at the end. So there's a mouse in every picture. So how many mice did you spot? What colour is the rabbit? That kind of thing. So there's a nice way for the adult to just sort of be guided in some interaction with the children at the end of reading a story.
And also, I've noticed, if we whiz back to fiction books, I've noticed in some adult fiction, what they do is they have a section of questions if you read the book for a book group.
Yeah, that's a really good idea. Yeah, and because that's such a growing thing, because you can have online book groups now. It's a really good idea. I wonder if that's the author who has helped put those together, or whether that's done in the
I don't know, but that's quite an interesting one to have. So back to children's books. The other thing that you can have at the back of the book is a challenge. So Laura, I've mentioned her, author of Don't Be Silly. She had a challenge at the end of her book of how to get the readers of her book to follow the footsteps of the hero of the story, who was Seth. Interestingly, Kylie Dixon of the Inkcap fame did the same in her latest book, Inkcap and the Blight of the Bonnets. She had a cool QR code. That's those funny little square, black and white, higgledy-piggledy squares that you can scan with your smartphone. And then it linked to a challenge on a web page where there was more details about it. Now, these add-ons will really help you make more money at the back end, as they will encourage the reader to give you their details and to get them onto your website or your platform. And then, of course, you can market to them with other activities or when the second book will be out. Obviously, just like with fiction and the other books that we've mentioned, you can have about the author, valuable retail space to share who you are and what you do. And then you can have the last page if you want, so just so it's not blank, is the next book. I always encourage you to include details of your next book. If you notice on most mainstream fiction writers, they include an excerpt of what's coming up, and this whets the appetite of your audience. So don't forget to add that. Even if you're not 100% sure what it's going to be, just making that commitment might help you then complete book 2.
Yeah.
You can have as little or as much as you like, but I would say don't put in stuff just for the sake of having a preface or an epilogue if it doesn't really need it. So just have a really good think about it before. I hope now you've got a clear idea of what needs to go into the book, or not, depending, and which camp you fall into in terms of the foreword. Which one do you want to do? Before the contents or after the contents? Next week, we're going to be looking at cover creation, and I'll be sharing vital info on what you need to think about before you even commission a cover designer, and handy little extras that you can put on your cover as well to entice the reader.
Oh, looking forward to that.
So that's everything from us for today. It's very much a goodbye from me.
And goodbye from me. Bye-bye.